There is something profoundly human about trying to fill the void. Perhaps that is why so many people lose themselves trying to find meaning in small things, in forgotten noises, in shadows cast by a cold lamp. This is not a tale of great deeds, nor of heroes or villains. It is a story about an ordinary man, a night watchman, and about how, in the silence of the early hours, he discovered an invisible power, the power to transform boredom into entire worlds. And before you think this is just another story of overcoming or escaping reality, I ask you to stay. Because what happened to him could, in some way, happen to any of us. And perhaps, when you finish listening, you will see your own dark nights in a different way. His name was Augusto. No one called him that. In the building, everyone knew him simply as the watchman. The man of the shadow shift. He came in at 10 at night, left when the sun was already scratching the tops of the buildings, and rarely exchanged more than 2 or 3 words with anyone. The work was simple, repetitive, almost anesthetic, observing monitors, noting movements, registering visits that never came. An invisible craft, in a place made of glass and silence. But boredom, when it settles in deeply, begins to ask dangerous questions. Augusto discovered this on a particularly long night, when the clock seemed to mock him. The routine was slowly consuming him, and the sound of the wind hitting the windows was his only company. It was there, in that immensity of nothing, that something began to move, not outside, but inside him. At first, it was just a game. He would look at the cameras and imagine stories. The man who walked quickly down the hallway could be an undercover agent. The woman who left a forgotten file on the desk might be hiding state secrets. The flickering lights, a coded message. A banal gesture gained another color, a silence became an omen. And, little by little, Augusto began to believe in these inventions. Not because he was naive, but because in them he found something reality had denied him a long time ago: meaning. There was a strange peace in imagining the impossible. While the city slept, he built plots within his own mind. He invented storylines, sketched characters, created dilemmas. And the more he imagined, the more reality lost the weight of being just reality. The cameras became portals, and the hallways, labyrinths of a secret world. The hours passed and, for the first time in years, Augusto didn't feel sleepy. He felt alive. Imagination became the air he breathed. And there was something profoundly human in that, transforming what oppresses into shelter, what suffocates into creation. But before diving deeper into this story, it might be important to state a truth that few have the courage to admit. Sometimes, the mind invents not out of vanity, but for survival. When reality becomes too small to contain the pain, the brain finds cracks, shortcuts, refuges. And what we call fantasy can be, in certain cases, a silent form of resistance. Augusto had no friends. Not because he was bitter, but because silence had become his language. His life consisted of few things: the night shift, the cold coffee from the machine, and the notebook where, from time to time, he jotted down loose words, fragments of ideas. No one knew this. No one imagined that, behind that navy blue uniform and tired gaze, an entire universe was forming. At that time, he still didn't know that the stories he created would be read by thousands of people. That one day, his words would emerge from the shadows to touch people he would never know. It all started with a snap one night when the loneliness weighed so heavily that he needed to invent a reason to stay awake. The building where he worked was one of those cold, impersonal corporate buildings. But at night, when everyone left, it changed. The automatic lights created drawings on the walls, the shadows seemed to breathe. And Augusto, sitting before the screens, felt he was about to witness something important not outside, but inside him. It was on a rainy night that everything began to transform. While observing a camera showing the 23rd floor, he noticed a figure. A shadow crossing the hallway, even after all the employees had left. He paused, zoomed in, looked carefully. Nothing. Perhaps a system glitch, perhaps just the reflection of lightning. But that night, Augusto decided he wouldn't let it pass. He took the notebook and wrote, "The man from the 23rd floor." From there, he began to imagine who that figure might be. A spy? A missing employee? A ghost of someone who never left? With each page, the mystery grew, and with it grew something Augusto had forgotten how to feel: purpose. The next day, as the sun rose and the cars filled the streets, He walked home with the strange sensation that something was changing. It hadn't been just an ordinary night. It was as if a window had opened inside him. And when that happens, it's impossible to go back to living as before. During the following months, the game became a habit. The stories multiplied, and the notebook, which was once just a jumble of scribbles, began to become something more cohesive, more alive. He didn't just invent plots, he felt them. And in each one, he left a piece of himself, a way of dealing with his own absence. Some say that imagination is the refuge of the weak, of those who cannot bear the harshness of reality. But Augusto proved the opposite. He transformed the void into narrative, monotony into art. And deep down, that is all creation has ever been, a desperate attempt to give form to the unspeakable. People saw him every day, always the same man, the same countenance. But no one imagined that, while drinking his bitter coffee and watching monitors, he was creating entire worlds. And if someone asked why, he probably wouldn't know how to answer. Perhaps because, sometimes, the reason to continue is not rational. It is just the instinct not to disappear completely. But it's curious how imagination, when fed for so long, begins to demand more. Like a flame asking for oxygen, it grows, consumes, transforms. Augusto began to lose himself in the stories he created. Sometimes, upon seeing someone on the cameras, he no longer knew if he was observing real life or a character he had invented. And this confusion, contrary to what one might think, didn't frighten him, it fascinated him. It was there, between the real and the imaginary, that he felt alive. You might be wondering why someone would choose to live like this, in an invented world. But perhaps the right question is, why not? When reality proves indifferent, creating is an act of courage. And Augusto, without knowing it, was beginning to write his own salvation. That's why, if you are listening to this story now, I invite you to stay until the end. Because what begins as a simple daydream will become something much larger, a journey between boredom and transcendence, between the mind and the soul. And believe me, you will want to know how it ends. The following nights became a mirror. Every time Augusto sat before the screens, it was as if he saw not only the building, but also himself, reflected in fragments of lives that didn't belong to him. The cameras showed clean hallways, empty rooms, motionless objects, and yet, he saw movement. He created invisible plots between the flickering lights and the echoes the wind left behind. He was a film director without an audience, a storyteller who spoke only to his own silence. And, in some way, that was enough. But something unsettled him. The line between what was invention and what was real began to dissolve. Sometimes, arriving at work, he had the impression that the stories written the previous night had left physical marks, as if the characters had crossed the pages and invaded that dead building. A fallen pen, a chair out of place, a light on in an empty floor. Small signs, almost imperceptible, but that made him doubt his own perception. One night, while reviewing the security recordings, he found something that made him shudder. On the video, a shadow crossed the hallway of the 23rd floor, the same one he used in his book. It was a human silhouette, indistinct, moving slowly towards the camera until it disappeared into the darkness. For a moment, Augusto felt his heart beat fast. He paused the image. Fast-forwarded. Rewound. Nothing. When he looked again, the shadow was no longer there. Was it a system error? Or some part of his imagination spilling onto the screen? The doubt gnawed at him. But instead of scaring him, the episode inspired him. He spent the following days obsessed with that figure. He wrote like a man possessed, describing the figure as a secret agent, someone who inhabited the threshold between worlds. With each page, the character gained more depth, more soul. It was a reflection of himself, he knew that. An invisible man, wandering in silence, seeking meaning where no one else saw it. His shift colleagues, few and distant, began to notice something different. Augusto always seemed distracted, with a distant gaze, as if he were somewhere else. One of them, an older security guard named Ramiro, even asked if everything was all right. Augusto replied only with a brief smile and a yes. How could he explain that his mind lived in two worlds at the same time? Meanwhile, the notebook was becoming a book. A collection of nights, of mixed ideas, of daydreams that, little by little, gained coherence. It was as if the stories had decided to organize themselves. Each character, each phrase, seemed to guide him towards something greater. And there was something almost spiritual in this process, as if, by writing, he were translating something that came from a place that didn't entirely belong to him. As the months passed, Augusto began to feel that this imaginary world wasn't just an escape. It was a form of dialogue. Reality spoke to him in codes, and he responded with words. The sound of the elevator became suspense. The wind, an omen. The blinking of a light, a hidden message. And the more he gave himself to this game, the more he perceived that perhaps madness and lucidity were not opposites, but neighbors. Sometimes, at dawn, when he left the building, the air outside seemed heavy. People rushed by, talking on their phones, with tired eyes. No one truly looked at each other. And Augusto thought, perhaps everyone is running away from something, but only a few have the courage to invent where they are going. That's what he did. He invented destinations, created reasons. And, in some way, that kept him alive. It was on one of those mornings that something unexpected happened. Arriving home, exhausted, he found a note slipped under the door. The handwriting was firm, unfamiliar. It said only, "I liked the man from the 23rd floor." Augusto stood still. His heart raced. Who could have written that? No one knew about the book. No one had access to what he wrote. For a moment, he thought it was a joke. But the doubt remained, and with it, the unsettling feeling that his imagination was beginning to take on a life of its own. From that day on, everything changed. Every detail began to seem charged with meaning. He began to doubt his own perception. Had he let something slip? Was someone watching him? Or was he just losing control of his own sanity? The human mind is a labyrinth, and Augusto was walking deeper and deeper inside his. But fear did not stop him from continuing to write. On the contrary, the invisible presence, real or imagined, became the engine of the story. Now, he wasn't creating just to fill the void, but to decipher an enigma. With each page, he had the sensation that he was approaching a revelation. The early hours became too long. There were nights when he forgot to eat, when his body trembled with fatigue, and yet he couldn't stop. The world he had created was too vivid to be set aside. When he closed his eyes, he saw the characters moving, talking to him, asking to exist. One night, one of the basement cameras began to fail. The screen flickered, hissed, until the image stabilized for a second. And there it was, the figure, standing before the emergency door. This time, the figure seemed to be looking directly into the lens, as if it knew it was being watched. Augusto felt a shiver run down his spine. And then, in an almost instinctive gesture, he began to narrate out loud what he saw, as if he were inside the story itself. From that point on, the boundary broke. He didn't just observe, he participated. He spoke with the characters, answered voices only he could hear, lived out plots that might never have existed. And, strangely, this loss of boundaries gave him peace. Reality became too small, and the world he had invented was vast, unpredictable, full of meaning. One night, Ramiro found him standing before the screens, motionless, his eyes fixed on a static image. When he called him, Augusto didn't answer. He seemed in a trance. After a few seconds, he turned slowly and asked, in a low voice, "Did you see him too?" Ramiro didn't understand. "Who?" he asked. Augusto smiled, a fragile smile, and replied, "The man from the 23rd floor." Ramiro walked away in silence. And Augusto, alone again, laughed at himself. Perhaps he really was going mad. But there was something liberating in that madness, as if, for the first time, he didn't need to explain himself. It was during this period that he began typing his notes on the old computer he had at home. The book was taking shape. The story mixed espionage, mystery, and something deeper, a silent search for meaning. He wasn't thinking about publishing. He wasn't thinking about readers. He wrote because he needed to. Because every word was a way to reorganize the chaos. The days became merely intervals between the nights. And, in the few hours he slept, he dreamed of the building's hallways. Sometimes, he saw the figure. Other times, he saw himself observing the figure. It was an endless spiral, as if he were trapped inside his own creation. But, at some point, something began to change. The stories he invented, once just a refuge, began to show him truths he himself didn't want to see. Each character seemed to carry a piece of his pain, each dialogue an unanswered question. And he began to understand that perhaps he wasn't just inventing, he was revealing himself. There is a moment when all creation becomes confession. And Augusto was about to reach it. But first, he would need to cross the most dangerous territory of all, the one where imagination ceases to be shelter and begins to become a mirror. And that is where the story truly begins. There is a point in every story where the protagonist ceases to be just a character and becomes the plot itself. Augusto reached that point without realizing it. The nights had become denser, the hours longer, and the borders of his mind became malleable, as if the real and the imaginary were merging into one continuous flow. He no longer wrote just to distract himself, he wrote to survive. The book was gaining structure, chapters, voices. The stories he invented became increasingly complex, and, in some way, more intimate. The man from the 23rd floor was no longer just a shadow, now he had a name, a past, dilemmas, remorse. He even had a recurring fear, that of being forgotten. And, describing this fear, Augusto realized how much he himself feared the same thing. It was a cold night when, for the first time, he realized he was crying while writing. The tears streamed silently, falling onto the keyboard. But it wasn't pure sadness, it was a kind of relief. As if he were finally managing to translate something that had been haunting him for a long time. It wasn't just a story about a building and a shadow. It was about him, about the void that work and loneliness had left, about the silent search for some meaning that would make him continue. From that night on, Augusto began to listen to himself more carefully. He recorded small audio clips on his phone while walking the hallways, describing what he saw as if he were narrating to someone invisible. He spoke softly, with an almost childlike tenderness. Now he is here. He waits, he watches. There is something he wants to tell me, but I don't know what yet. The tone of voice was calm, but there was something there, a vibration between fascination and fear. And, little by little, Augusto began to feel that the man from the 23rd floor was more than a creation. It was a symbol, a mirror, a part of himself that he had left forgotten in the depths of his unconscious, and that now, under the white lights of the cameras, was taking form. The following week, something surprised him. A new employee started working in the building, a young man in his 20s named Enrique. He was curious, friendly, and had a habit of talking even when the other person didn't respond much. In the first few nights, Augusto tried to keep his distance, but the young man seemed genuinely interested in understanding how the work functioned. And, in a way, that interest disconcerted him. Enrique began asking simple questions: how many cameras there were, how long Augusto had worked there, if he had ever seen anything strange. And, without realizing it, Augusto began to answer more than he should. He told him about the figure, about the 23rd floor, about the book he was writing. Enrique laughed, thinking it was just a made-up story. But there was something in his laugh that wasn't mockery, it was enchantment. He wanted to read it. And, for the first time, Augusto hesitated to show it. For days, he was in doubt. What would happen if someone read it? Would his stories cease to be his? Would they be interpreted as madness? Or, perhaps, as genius? In the end, he gave in. He handed the notebook to the young man, his heart racing. Enrique took it home and promised to return it in 2 days. Those 2 days felt like an eternity. Augusto couldn't concentrate on anything. The building seemed different, as if the silence were watching him. And when Enrique returned, there was something new in his gaze, a silent respect, a contained admiration. He simply said, "You need to show this to the world." Augusto didn't reply. He felt a mix of joy and fear. Showing meant opening up, exposing his own wounds. But, at the same time, there was a spark of hope. Perhaps his stories had value. Perhaps that invented world could touch other real worlds. In the days that followed, Enrique insisted that he type everything up, revise it, send it to publishers. Augusto resisted. He didn't see himself as a writer. He was just a watchman. An ordinary man who filled the early hours with fantasy. But Enrique didn't give up. He said there was something rare in his words, a melancholy that seemed to speak to the times. Meanwhile, the book grew, and the line between creation and reality became even thinner. Sometimes, Augusto saw the figure in places where there were no cameras. Reflections in windows, shadows crossing the hallway, distant sounds. He knew it could be fatigue, but on some level, he wanted to believe it was something more. Because if it were just his mind, then everything he had created would be a lie. And he needed it to be real. There was one night when the unexpected happened. The camera system froze completely, all screens flickering at once. The power fluctuated and, for a few seconds, the building plunged into darkness. Augusto stood still, breathing deeply, waiting for the light to return. When the screens lit up again, one of them showed something impossible. Himself, sitting before the monitor, being observed from another angle. He froze. It was an impossible image. There was no camera positioned behind the surveillance desk. And yet, there he was, seen from the outside, as if he were a character in a story being filmed by another. The screen flickered, and the image disappeared. Augusto stood there, stunned. It was a technical error, no doubt. But part of him didn't want that explanation. Perhaps it was the man from the 23rd floor, himself, looking back. And that idea chilled him in a way that reason couldn't erase. The next morning, when he told Enrique what he had seen, the young man smiled and said that was fate giving a sign, the omen of something great. And, for the first time, Augusto wanted to believe that. He decided to finish the book. He spent entire nights revising, typing, polishing sentences. And the more he wrote, the more he felt something inside him healing. As if, by narrating his own shadows, they lost the power to haunt him. There was a phrase that repeated in several parts of the book, a kind of mantra: what is imagined is also lived. For Augusto, that summed everything up. The borders between what existed and what he created no longer mattered. Because, in the end, what we feel is as real as what we touch. When he finished the last chapter, he felt a different silence. Not the silence of the empty building, but the silence that comes after a long journey. It was peace, but also fear. What would happen now that the story was complete? Enrique, excited, insisted on helping him send the manuscript to publishers. Augusto agreed, almost unable to believe it. Days later, the response arrived. A small, independent publisher was interested. They wanted to publish the book. And suddenly, the man who had spent years watching shadows in the early hours saw his name printed on a cover. The launch would be discreet, almost symbolic. Augusto didn't expect much. But when the book was released, something unexpected happened. People started reading it. And what they saw there wasn't just a mystery story, but a portrait of human loneliness, of the mind that creates so as not to die. Readers saw themselves in it, in the man from the 23rd floor, in the watchman, in his confusions and silent searches. The reviews were kind. They said the author had a sensitive, introspective, poetic writing style. That the book spoke about the power of imagination as resistance. Augusto, accustomed to invisibility, saw his name in reviews and interviews. But inside, something remained the same. Because recognition, though sweet, did not replace the mystery that had driven him. He still thought about the figure. He still felt that something was watching him in the early hours. But now, instead of fear, he felt gratitude. That shadow, real or not, had given him a purpose. And deep down, he knew, the man from the 23rd floor was never another. It had always been himself, trying to see himself in a different light. But the story, of course, wasn't over yet. Because every revelation, when it arrives, brings with it a new question. And the one Augusto was about to face would be the deepest of all, one that would force him to look directly into the abyss between who he was and who he imagined himself to be. And that is where things truly begin to transform. Success came like a whisper. No explosion, no sudden fame. Just a sequence of small waves, readers commenting online, critics mentioning his name, messages arriving with stories of people who recognized themselves in the book's pages. Augusto read each one with astonishment and a certain discomfort. He didn't know how to handle the idea that something born from his solitude was now touching other solitudes. There was something sacred in that kind of encounter, something that made him realize that, perhaps, his suffering had had a purpose. But, at the same time, the echo of external voices began to awaken noises within him. The nights, once his silent accomplices, became heavy again. The building remained the same: long hallways, flickering cameras, the buzz of the lights, but now there was a subtle difference. The mystery had been told, published, exposed. And Augusto felt as if he had torn a piece of himself and placed it before the world. A piece that no longer belonged to him. He tried to carry on with the work as before, but he couldn't anymore. Everything seemed to have lost its secret shine. The void that once inspired him now became uncomfortable. The silence, which had been a shelter, began to become a weight. It was as if, by transforming pain into literature, he had also emptied the very source. For weeks, Augusto tried to convince himself it was just a phase. That the recognition had thrown him off balance, that he needed time to find himself again. But something deeper was happening. He felt pursued by an absence. The man from the 23rd floor, the one who had inspired him, had vanished. No figure, no shadow, no sign. The building seemed dead and, in some way, he did too. It was on one of those silent nights, when boredom began to creep back in, that something strange happened. One of the ground floor cameras captured an unusual image: a man standing in front of the main entrance, motionless, looking directly at the dark glass. The quality was poor, the figure indistinct, but there was something in the gesture, in the posture, that made him freeze. The shadow was back. Augusto stood up, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the screen. The figure seemed to be waiting. By an inexplicable impulse, he went down. The elevator slid slowly, and each passing floor seemed like a deeper plunge into the unknown. When he reached the ground floor, the hallway was empty. He opened the glass door and looked outside. The street, deserted. The cold night air enveloped him. No sign of anyone. He stood there, still, for long minutes. He felt his heart beating fast, but not from fear, from expectation. It was as if he were on the verge of something. Something he couldn't name. He returned to the surveillance room and reviewed the footage. The figure was there, yes, but it disappeared exactly at the moment he opened the door. That night, he couldn't work anymore. He took the notebook, that first, worn-out one, and began to write. The words came out like a fever. He didn't know what he was narrating, perhaps a continuation, perhaps an outpouring. He wrote about the invisible that watches the man, about the creator being watched by his creation, about the cycle that doesn't close. When day broke, Augusto had a new story. He didn't know if it was good, if it made sense, but he felt something he hadn't felt in months, a purpose being reborn. He understood, then, that inspiration isn't born from glory, but from the void. That it is in silence, in boredom, in the absurdity of repetition, that the mind finds space to invent. In the following days, he began working on a new book. Different from the first, denser, darker, more confessional. This time, there was no external mystery. Everything happened inside the head of a man who confused the real and the imaginary. A man who narrated his own madness as if it were salvation. Enrique read the first few chapters and was silent for a few seconds before saying, "It feels truer." Augusto smiled. Truer was a dangerous word, because he no longer knew what that meant. As he wrote, he began to notice something curious. The people who crossed his path, a colleague, a delivery person, a random passerby, somehow seemed familiar. As if they had already appeared in his stories. Sometimes, he recognized gestures, phrases, expressions. It was a coincidence, certainly. But too much coincidence begins to feel like a message. On a rainy night, while watching the cameras, a notification appeared on the monitor, something that shouldn't exist in the system. A message typed on the surveillance screen itself, in white letters on a black background: "Keep writing." Augusto's heart raced. He ran his hands over the keyboard, tried to erase it, restarted the system. Nothing. The message had vanished on its own, as if it had never existed. He laughed, nervously. Perhaps it was a technical error. Or perhaps not. From that night on, he began to feel a sharper presence. It wasn't fear, it was companionship. A kind of silent energy that seemed to watch him as he wrote. And, in some way, he felt comforted by it. It didn't matter if it was delusion, what mattered was what it produced within him. The new book progressed, and with it came intense dreams. Augusto dreamed of hallways that never ended, doors that opened to places he didn't recognize, voices that whispered his name. Sometimes, he woke up sweating, his heart racing. But even so, he wrote about these dreams. It was as if his mind had become the very setting. Enrique noticed the fatigue. He tried to convince him to take a vacation, but Augusto refused. "I can't stop now," he said. "If I stop, the voices fall silent." The boundary between the creator and the creation became increasingly tenuous. There were nights when Augusto found himself writing dialogues with a man from the 23rd floor himself, now completely aware that he was a projection, a mirror. And, in one of these dialogues, he wrote a phrase that made him shudder: "You didn't invent me. I was always here. I was just waiting for you to look at me." Those words stayed with him for days. He began to wonder if, perhaps, the man from the 23rd floor was more than a metaphor. What if he were the personification of everything he had denied: his anger, his loneliness, his desire to be seen? Perhaps, creating was just the most sophisticated form of confession. The book was almost ready when Augusto noticed something disturbing: the dates. Every event he described in the chapters coincided with real events: power outages, camera glitches, employee absences. It was impossible, but it was a fact. It was as if the book were writing time itself, as if what he created materialized in the world. One night, while revising a chapter, he heard a noise on the floor above. A sound of slow footsteps. He took the flashlight and went up, trying to convince himself it was just the wind. But when he reached the 23rd floor, he felt the air was colder. The hallway was dark, and at the end of it, for a brief instant, he saw a shadow move. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice hoarse. No answer. Just the sound of the distant elevator, echoing like a metallic sigh. He took 2 steps forward. The floor creaked under his feet. Then, suddenly, the light flickered and the figure was there, standing a few meters away. It wasn't clear, but there was a human form, motionless, looking directly at him. Time seemed to stop. The air grew heavy. Augusto felt something inside him break, not from fear, but from recognition. Because, in that instant, he knew. The figure had his features, his posture, his silence. It was himself. The shadow disappeared, and the hallway was empty. But Augusto understood what it meant. The man from the 23rd floor had always been him, the part he projected into the stories, the echo of his own mind trying to reconcile with what he had lost. That night, he went back down to the surveillance room and wrote the last sentence of the new book: "Perhaps reality is just the fiction we haven't yet understood." When he finished, he didn't cry. He just looked at the screens, one by one, like someone saying goodbye. He felt a strange serenity, a certainty that something had been completed. And, for the first time, he turned off the system before sunrise. In the days that followed, he gave the manuscript to Enrique and asked him to take care of it. He said he needed some time, that he was going to disappear for a few days, without giving details. Enrique tried to insist, but Augusto's gaze was too calm to argue with. And that was how the man who watched the shadows left the building. No one saw him again. No one could say for sure where he went. Some colleagues said Augusto simply never returned to work, that his badge was left forgotten on the desk, next to the cold coffee and the worn-out notebook. Others swear they saw him a few days later, walking along the city's waterfront at dawn, with a distant gaze, as if he were following a voice only he could hear. But the truth is that his disappearance wasn't exactly an escape. It was, perhaps, a kind of return. Enrique, the closest friend he had had, kept the manuscript as one keeps something sacred. He hesitated for weeks before deciding what to do. There was something mysterious in the last pages, as if Augusto knew that would be his farewell. The text ended abruptly, but with a strange serenity, almost prophetic. The publisher agreed to publish it anyway, saying that this unfinished end was what made the book even more powerful. When the second book was launched, the impact was different. It wasn't just a work of fiction, it was a testament. People read it and felt as if they were hearing someone confess secrets that belonged to everyone. It spoke about the threshold between the real and the imaginary, about the price of looking inside oneself to the point where lucidity and madness touch. The public reacted intensely. Some felt comforted, some felt unsettled, and some swore that, after reading, They had dreamed of the same hallways Augusto described. Enrique began receiving messages from readers saying disturbing things. Some claimed to have seen figures in their own homes. Others said they heard the sound of footsteps during the night. The book seemed to awaken something. It was as if Augusto's words, born from silence, had opened a crack into something invisible, a kind of collective mirror where each person saw themselves and, at the same time, got lost. But Enrique knew the story wasn't about ghosts. It was about the invisible power of human imagination, about the capacity we have to give form to what we cannot bear to face. Augusto had found, in fantasy, the only possible path to not be swallowed by his own solitude. And, in some way, that courage resonated in everyone who read him. Time passed. The book gained recognition, modest awards, and Augusto's name began to circulate in literary circles. Critics said his work was a metaphor for the modern condition, the isolated man, trapped in routine, creating internal worlds as a way not to succumb to the world's indifference. Others called him a visionary. But no one knew what had happened to him. Until, a year later, Enrique received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a typed sheet of paper, with a phrase, "Don't try to understand what is real. Just choose what keeps you alive." The signature was his. No address, no sign. Just that phrase, which seemed to echo all the words he had written before. Enrique stored the sheet in silence. He knew Augusto was still out there, somewhere perhaps not physically, but present in the cracks between the visible and the imagined, where everything invisible continues to exist. And, in a way, he never left. Because Augusto's work began to grow, to spread like a whisper among people who might never meet, but who shared the same feeling, the sensation that, behind every tired routine, there is an entire universe waiting to be invented. There is a scene in his last book that many consider symbolic, a watchman observing the cameras of an empty building and, suddenly, realizing that he is also being filmed. It is the moment he understands that the gaze that seeks meaning is the same one that creates meaning. This passage became legendary, quoted in lectures, analyzed in articles, interpreted in every possible way. But few realized that what Augusto meant was something simple, almost childlike, that inventing is a form of existing. And it is here that this story finds its heart. Because what it shows us is not the trajectory of a man who went mad, but of someone who had the courage to get lost in order to find himself. Augusto didn't escape reality. He reinvented it. He made boredom a studio, solitude a fertile field, silence a dialogue. He transformed what was crushing him into living matter. And in doing so, he discovered that the power of the human mind is, at once, a refuge and a risk, because whoever allows themselves to dream too much runs the danger of not wanting to wake up anymore. But perhaps that is the true miracle of resilience, to continue creating even when the world seems to have forgotten you. Augusto didn't fight against reality, he molded it with words, gave it new contours, new rules, and thus survived it. And if there is anything his journey teaches us, it is that sanity is not always on the side of truth. Sometimes, salvation lives precisely in what we invent so as not to succumb. Some seek strength in facts, others in faith. Augusto sought it in fiction and found something more solid than the concrete of the buildings he watched: a purpose. Today, his books are still read. Some interpret them as metaphors for depression, some see in them a portrait of the solitary artist, and some are simply moved by the beauty of an ordinary man turning nothing into art. And that is what really matters. Because every time someone reads his words, a little of that imaginary universe comes back to life. And if you have made it this far, you might realize that this story was never just about Augusto. It was, in some way, about you too, about what you do with your voids, about the stories you invent to endure the days, about the courage to believe that what is born in the mind can change real life. Because, when all is said and done, the invisible power of human resilience lies exactly in this, in the capacity to transform what is unbearable into something beautiful, what is lonely into something shared. Augusto showed us that imagination is not an escape, it is a form of silent resistance, a way to keep breathing when the world seems too small. And, before concluding, there is something he himself would have said if he could speak to you now. If reality hurts you, invent another. It's not a lie, it's survival. So, if this story touched you, if you recognized yourself in some part of it, remember not to let it die here. Share it with someone who needs to hear that there is still beauty in the invisible. Comment on what you felt, what you thought, what you imagined. Because stories only stay alive when they pass from one mind to another. And if you want to keep following stories like this one, subscribe, stick around. There are still many ways to look at the world, and some of them can only be seen when the lights go out and imagination awakens. And who knows, on some silent night, when you are alone with your own thoughts, you might also find your 23rd floor, that secret place where the real and the imaginary meet, and where the mind, finally, learns to breathe. Because, deep down, that's what this is all about. Not escaping, but inventing. Not defeating boredom, but transforming it into art. Not finding answers, but continuing to create questions. And if life is made of vigils and voids, may each of us learn, like Augusto, to look into the darkness and say, "There is still light in here."